Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So there seem to be a lot of people who watch videos of sparring footage online and are somewhat confused about either what they're looking at or what they think they should be seeing, or what is reality. And so let's set out a few things here. So first of all, there are many different ways of sparring. Okay, there's the kind of eskrima stick fighting approach where two people essentially wail on each other, not a criticism, but that's the sort of one extreme end of the spectrum, and hit each other lots and lots and lots of times, and often it finishes in a clinch or grapple or on the floor. That's one approach. The other end would be something like Olympic épée, where literally it's the person who touches the other person with the tip of their weapon 1/25th of a second before they themselves are touched. And so those are the kind of, in my mind, those are the two easiest to illustrate extreme ends of the spectrum. Okay, so you've got one where people are just hit for like 3 minutes, hit with two sticks, and then grapple, hit, fall on the ground, grapple, hit. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is cagey, poke. One person got there 25th of a second before the other, that person's the winner. Okay, so they're the two ends of the spectrum. And in the middle, as far as weapon-based martial arts are concerned, and that's, I'm going to come back to that point in a second, those are the two ends of the spectrum. And all other weapon-based martial arts occupy usually, I can't think of any that don't fit somewhere along that spectrum. Weapon-based martial arts fits somewhere along that spectrum between those two extremes of Olympic épée and eskrima stick fighting. And what we do in HEMA is varied. We don't have only one set of rules for HEMA. HEMA is practiced all over the world by many different groups with many different types of weapons. It covers many different periods and many different systems. It could be 17th century rapier, it could be 18th century small sword, it could be 19th century bayonet, it could be 15th century dagger, it could be 19th century bowie knife, it could be 14th century sword and buckler. It's very, very diverse, okay, many different weapons, from polearms to swords to knives, but the main thing is that most of what we look at HEMA is weapon based. Now that's not totally true. So in terms of the unarmed martial arts, they're very, very different. And so the one fundamental point, I think a lot of people come from unarmed martial arts such as karate, judo, aikido, jiu-jitsu, muay thai, modern kickboxing, boxing, wrestling, catch wrestling, whatever. And they look at weapon-based martial arts, and if they don't have a background in weapon-based martial arts, there's an instant lack of comprehension there, because in unarmed martial arts you can trade blows for quite a period of time in many circumstances until a person is subdued, knocked out, their arms are broken or whatever, okay, choked out, all this kind of stuff. That's entirely different to weapon-based martial arts. If we're talking about sharp weapons, which usually in HEMA we are, yes indeed, with sticks, sometimes with sticks you can be talking about beating someone down and subduing them in a way that's a little bit like boxing. But if we're talking about swords, spears, knives, for example, then really any one of those hits could instantly finish the fight. And this is the premise at which épée rules come from. They come from the idea that if you insert a blade into someone's body, so to speak, then they stop being able to function, or at least stop being able to function in a useful way. Now let's just examine that for a minute. So another accusation that comes out from sort of armchair experts on the internet when they look at HEMA videos is they're like, oh well, that person was only hit you know, lightly with that sword, that wouldn't have stopped them from fighting. Well, first of all, it might have done, okay? So as I've mentioned in comments, your body is a mechanical device, okay? So sometimes human bodies can sustain huge amounts of damage and a person can keep functioning. However, sometimes someone can have a blade inserted a few centimeters or even just a couple of centimeters into some part of their body and they will stop being able to function. An example would be in your eyeball. If you receive a sword point in your eyeball, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to fight effectively for at least the next few seconds. Okay. Another example would be a relatively light and superficial cut across the back of your hand. Why? Because your hand's got tendons across it. If you sever those tendons, your hand doesn't work properly, at least. If your hand doesn't work properly, what can't it do? Well, it can't operate your weapon. So even though, in some cases, people can sustain huge amounts of damage and still fight on, in other situations, people can sustain quite light or apparently superficial damage, and it can completely put them out of action. And it's completely, more or less, it's completely impossible to predict what damage a given strike or poke with a sharp sword, for example, might do to a person. You could stab someone in the body and they might drop down dead. Or you might stab someone in the body and they might fight on for a few minutes and then drop down dead. You could stab someone in the body and they might be in great pain but survive and be absolutely fine. Or you might stab someone in the body, they might not even feel it, and hours later, or let's say sometime after the fight's finished, they'll notice that they're bleeding profusely and they feel a bit faint, but they get fixed up and they're fine. Okay? Or it might be a superficial wound that they die of infection from weeks later or even months later. So there's any, you know, the spectrum of possible consequences of a wound are so complex and so diverse and so difficult to predict, and two people in different mental states, different ages, and different states of health, in different levels of intoxication, can have different physiological effects from a given wound. So it's extremely difficult to predict what effect a weapon might have on a person. So you can see very quickly this starts to get complex. Now, HEMA rules are diverse, partly because they cover different systems, partly because they cover different periods, different weapons, but also they're diverse for many people, and this includes my club, for a very specific reason. And that is because we believe that if we all adopt exactly the same set of rules, then we're going to fall into the same pitfall and trap that, for example, Olympic fencing or kendo has fallen into. And that is where people only are training to win to those rules. And the problem with any set of rules is any set of rules will introduce false artifacts and false things that aren't really like real martial arts and real training, and people will train to win to those rules. And as soon as you're training to win to the rules rather than training to fight in, you know, real life, not that hopefully most of us will ever have to, but you might, you know, if it's knife defense and things like that, you might have to, or indeed certain types of grappling if you're, you know, working the doors, or you're in the military, or this kind of stuff, potentially even bayonet as well. But for the most part, we kind of have the ethos that if you don't train to only to win to competition rules, if you train the martial art, the historical martial art, you're training something kind of pure and that is a proper martial art and not just a sport. And a clear example of that is if we go back to the épée fencing example. So épée fencers, great athletes, greatly skilled, hugely, you know, fast, and all of this kind of stuff, lots of admirable qualities. But if you go into a fight with, say for example, sharp small swords, and you fence with an épée fencing mentality, both people do, the likelihood is that both people are just going to kill each other, okay? Because the épée rules don't teach you to train for, they only train you to go for the first hit and pretty much ignore what happens after that, okay? We won't go into a kind of more in-depth analysis on that. It should be fairly simple to understand that. So very clearly, the way that you train for a duel, for example, is somewhat different to the way that you train for an Olympic fencing match. Equally, kendo. So kendo and kenjutsu are obviously related and come from the same root, but it's very clear to see that there are certain things that are done in kendo that you, for example, guard positions that you stand in or guard positions that you don't stand in, that wouldn't necessarily be true of using a katana in an actual fight, because as a straight off example, in kendo, your hands are very vulnerable, but for the most part, there's only one real hit to the hand that counts as a strike to the, you know, a valid strike in kendo, and so the hands more or less are treated as invulnerable a lot of the time. And of course, there is only one thrust that counts in kendo. In real life, with a katana, any number of thrusts. You could thrust someone in the leg, and of course, that might, that might kill them by severing their femoral artery. There's all sorts of things that you can do with a katana and is done in kenjutsu that is not done in kendo, because kendo has narrowed its view down into winning within the context of kendo. So martial arts are very different. In HEMA, therefore, we have diverse rules for a range of reasons, but also very importantly because we've chosen to have a diverse set of rules so that we don't fall into the pitfalls of some other martial arts that have gone before and we only are training one specific way to win in that competition, because that's not what we're about. We're trying to reconstruct martial arts for the most part that have died out, and we're trying to bring them back and understand the historical treatises. And to do that, we need to understand the martial art, not only understand one specific modern sporting application of it. So you can see where I'm hopefully going with this. So when you're looking at videos of HEMA sparring or HEMA tournaments on YouTube, for example, or anywhere else on the internet, there are a few things you have to bear in mind. First of all, any hit with a weapon could fundamentally change how that fight turns out. Even if it's a superficial cut, if it's a superficial cut to someone's, that opens up a vein in someone, or affects their vision or breathing or tendons or muscle, then that's going to change how the fight pans out afterwards. Yes, it might not kill a person, but if you slash someone across the hand and that severs their tendons, well, anything that happens after that point, you can't simulate within that sparring or competition scenario, because that hand with a sharp sword wouldn't be operating properly anymore. So yes, they might be able to fight on, but they wouldn't be able to fight on in the same way that they would in a tournament or a sparring scenario where the hand is perfectly fine, because you haven't just severed their tendons with a sharp sword. You've only sort of dragged the edge across their hand, okay? So if I'm fighting someone, long sword, and I happen to drag my edge across the inside of their arm, and they'll go, oh, that was really soft, and they'll just carry on like normal. But in real life, if I've dragged my sharp edge across their arm, severed muscle, severed veins, severed tendons, their arm doesn't work properly anymore. And that's why sometimes, and not always, that's why sometimes we stop after one hit. Not because we're saying that person is now dead, but because we're saying that person would now no longer be able to fight in a normal way. And we can't simulate that within this competitive situation. Sometimes we might have a bout where we do like a screamer and we just go hit, 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 hit and carry on. But of course, with machetes or with sharp knives, as the traditional origin of a screamer and Kali and Arnis was, obviously the first or second or third hit with those sharp knives would probably mean the end of that fight. However, there is some virtue and some benefit to, within a training environment, within a sparring or competition environment, just doing hit, 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 hit and carrying on, because you're measuring other qualities. You're measuring stamina, and you're seeing how a person flows, and you're seeing how a person carries on. So you're measuring those things, but it doesn't simulate a real fight. None of these things do. None of these things simulate a real fight, because it's not a real fight. Psychologically, it's not a real fight, and the weapons aren't real weapons, and they're not doing real damage to the person. They're not cutting, they're not thrusting. That person isn't bleeding, their tendons aren't severed, their muscles are intact. And so, sometimes we do one hit bouts, sometimes we do multiple hit, just flurries, carry on, and sometimes we do something in the middle. Sometimes we do weighted scoring, where we say if a person gets chopped in the head, then they get a certain number of points, or there's a certain consequence, or they're not allowed to give an afterblow. But if they're hit in the body, maybe they are allowed the afterblow, because that probably wouldn't impede them from giving an afterblow, even though they might be grievously wounded. So, there's all kinds of things in between. So going back to the beginning, whilst we have this spectrum with sort of épée, modern Olympic épée at one end and a screamer at the other end, within HEMA, we have rules that span all of that spectrum all the way along. And I must just to conclude, reiterate that none of these things simulate a real fight. They can't, okay? All you're doing is you're looking at specific skill sets and specific things that you want to pick up in the fight. The final example I'll use is the recent melee footage I put up. So most people, I think, thought that was fun. The melee games we do, we pretty much only do them at the end of a night of sparring. Sparring for us is usually one-on-one. We have a more or less standard set of rules, which is the Fight Camp rules, Fight Camp standard rules, which you can look up on the Fight Camp website, fightcamp.co.uk. And we mostly fight to those kind of rules, which are a kind of average rule set that you find would be similar to lots of rules used throughout HEMA all over the world. But the melee has to, by necessity, be somewhat different. The melee, we stop after one hit. So when we're fighting, it's essentially tag. If you get tagged, you stop and you drop out. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, for the reason I mentioned, if you got hit once by a sharp sword and you're wearing just clothes like I'm wearing now, there's a good chance that that could do enough damage to you with a sharp sword that it might open up part of your body, cause you to bleed profusely, sever tendons, cause you breathing problems, vision problems, anything like that. Okay, so it could have a big physiological effect on you. That's the first reason. But the second reason is more practical and is really a sporting and fun aspect to it. It's because we're fighting in an honor-based thing. We're calling our shots. Okay, so if you get hit, you go, yep, I was hit, I'm out. Okay, because you don't know how you'd be able to fight after that hit. You can't simulate that within the sparring environment. But also it would be completely, well, not completely, but very, very difficult to run a melee situation where a person is carrying on after being hit, because you'd lose track of who's been hit, how many times, where, and how well. A melee situation is chaotic enough and difficult enough to self-judge, and even harder to judge other people. But even just to self-judge is very difficult in a melee environment because there's so much going on. That quite simply the easiest way to do it is just go, okay, if you get hit, you just drop out. Okay, so we do it like paintball or airsoft or whatever, you know, this kind of, you get tagged, you're out. It's a game, it's a training game, and what we're really focusing on is dealing with multiple threat scenarios, dealing with looking at awareness, where your buddies are, all of this kind of stuff, and using a little bit of, you know, tricks and feints and this type of stuff and angles. And so it's not supposed to be a simulation of a real melee. It's just supposed to give you a tiny view, a tiny window into melee fighting. Anyway, I hope that helps elaborate and educate and make a little bit clearer what HEMA sparring is about, or indeed any weapon-based martial arts sparring, and how to view it. Don't view it as a simulation of reality. It can never be that. But different rules are focusing on and accentuating different skill sets in order so we can become better martial artists, and also for fun. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.